I want to talk to you about Michael Pierce. I want to talk to you about Kirk Cousins. I want to talk to you about offense, defense. Let's get into it here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
Ooh-wee! You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL, shows on Twitter at Locked On Vikings, and of course, you can find the show on YouTube. We took a little break over the holidays on YouTube. We're back on YouTube. If you missed any of the other shows, if you're a YouTube viewer and you want to go check out those old shows from like last week, you can do so anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. But let's get into it. Today's going to be a tape day. And I got 2 games worth of tape that I kind of caught up on all day because, of course, again, I was out, so I couldn't really do the real deep study. It was holidays with family and all that. So catching up on both the Bears and the Rams game. We'll focus mostly on the Rams game, but there's a couple things from the Bears game that'll come up. And we'll do that for most of the day. But first, a really funny piece of news. Thanks to a bunch of COVID problems and roster shenanigans and stuff, the Vikings signed Kyle Sloter to their active roster. This is the second time he's been on the active roster. I think the first time was 2018. Sloter was on the active roster. So that's really funny. Obviously, I mean, he didn't work out really anywhere. He had a lot of trouble getting like play calls relayed in, at least I think was the reporting. And he had trouble, with the kind of mental processing, not processing like most quarterbacks where it's like processing things live and reading, but just like the operation of the game. And he did that poorly enough to not really be able to stick on a team. But I guess the Vikings are a little desperate right now. Sean Mannion still on the COVID-19 IR. This probably implies that they don't expect him to be back in time for the Green Bay Packers game. He's probably like a symptomatic case. And then, of course, both Cousins and Kellen Mond are unvaccinated, which increases their likelihood of also being unavailable. So I guess they wanted another body in the room so that they wouldn't be scrambling in the event of a positive. Although, I don't know, man, if they were scrambling, it's hard to imagine that going worse than Kyle Sloter. So whatever. We'll see how that. Hopefully we won't see how that turns out. Actually, I do not want to see how that turns out. I would love for this to only be a joke. Also, it probably bears mentioning that the NFL adjusted its COVID policy. Dr. Alan Sills had a whole thing on this. The CDC's had a whole thing on this. But basically, Omicron's a new variant. It's very much the dominant strain of COVID right now. The vast majority of cases are the Omicron variant. And the Omicron variant behaves a little differently than all the COVID we've had over the last 2 years. It processes through you a little bit faster. You see symptoms faster. You stop being infectious faster. And that last part's really important. So the NFL has said that once you test positive, the new minimum for an unvaccinated player, this is really important to Vikings fans, by the way, because this applies to Dalvin Cook. The new minimum for an unvaccinated player is 5 days. It used to be 10 days. You could be asymptomatic, negative tests, totally over it by day 6. But if you were unvaccinated, you would still have to wait those extra 4 days. Now that's no longer true. Now it's only a 5-day minimum. Now you could be, negative, asymptomatic, blah, blah, blah on day 3, and you would still have to sit out 2 extra days. But 5 days is less than 10. So increased likelihood that, Dalvin Cook is ready and able to go. But of course, he could also be a symptomatic case or whatever. So we still have to wait and see if he actually gets back and is available for the Packers game. And that Packers game is really important. As much as I've decried the Vikings, and I kind of feel like this is over because I just don't see this. There's too many problems with the team. We'll talk about it later. Look, if they steal one against the Packers, they're above a 50% chance to make the playoffs. Like, suddenly all they have to do is take care of the Bears and have a couple of favorites win, and they're like in. So it's definitely not over yet. And so let's talk about those problems, though. So moving on to kind of the tape side of things, I guess the first thing I want to do is I go into a lot more detail about this with a zone coverage article that came out today. But basically a big question that I wasn't really able to answer very well on the mailbag yesterday was what's going on with the run defense And a lot of it was in the vein of like, hey, I thought we paid a bunch of money to defensive tackles. Why isn't the run defense good? And that's an easy conclusion to jump to, but I always guard against jumping to conclusions because it's one of those things where like a tendency is not a fact. It's just kind of a usually. Usually, your defensive tackles, if they're good, you'll have a good run defense. If they're bad, you'll have a bad run defense. Like there's a correlation there. And if you were going to guess, that would be a reasonable, educated guess, but it would still be a guess. And in this case, something different is going on. And after watching back the Bears and the Rams game from the coaches' film angles and stuff and really getting into it the way that I usually can with games, oh my God, Michael Pierce is on a heater. Like he is dominating. And Dalvin Tomlinson has been not quite as disruptive, but still very disruptive. Those two dudes are killing it. And other mistakes elsewhere on the team are making it not relevant. So I would say, if you want a true scapegoat, if you want a guy to launch into the sun, it's DJ Wanham, who is struggling to hold his spot. Like he's getting washed out a little bit, but I think also he's getting lured out of position a lot. And I think he's playing a little bit too wild and a little bit too aggressively, a little bit too uncontrolled. There is this kind of the developmental arc of a given player. I've talked about this before. You know, you start out and you're slow and you're wrong, right? You're processing a lot and you also don't really know what you're looking at. That's a rookie that's not ready to play, will be kind of slow to do everything and also not have the right answers. And then eventually you study and you figure it out and you can get the right answers, but you're still slow, so you're slow and right. And then an instinct kicks in. It's an undeveloped instinct, but it's faster. So you're fast and wrong. And then eventually that instinct gets correct. And then you get to be fast and right. And that's when your athleticism takes over. And then suddenly on a dime, you turn into this fantastic player, or whatever your potential is. Wanham's in stage 3 now of that. I think he used to be kind of slow and right a little bit. Now he's playing on a little more instinct, fast and wrong. That leads to worse plays, but it is a step toward better. But right now he's crashing too far inside and not doing a very good job of reading when his gaps change versus power and stuff. And that all means that he's not setting the edge very well. And all of the Vikings edge rushers are doing a poor job setting the edge, either not holding up their spots, Tayshaun Bauer rushing too far upfield on one. There's a lot of examples of the Vikings not setting the edge. So, look, you could have Thor and the Incredible Hulk at defensive tackle. It doesn't matter if you can't set the edge because the running back can just run away from those two guys. And that's kind of what's happening here. You'll have, like, in a lot of cases, Michael Pierce will put a center into the turf and it won't matter because the guy just bounced the run outside because DJ Wanham ran it. So that kind of problem has really plagued the Vikings run defense, but there's a lot more going on that I want to talk about. I want to clarify some things with Kirk Cousins, and really, I want to dive a little deeper into where he's at right now. I think he's going through this weird mechanical chapter of his career, and it's interesting to talk about, and it's some of the other things. So we'll talk about all that. First, let me talk to you about the best tasting protein bar on the planet. It's Built Bar. Built Bar is a delicious snack that can satisfy those late night cheat day cravings, but it's not actually a cheat day. And especially if you're one of those resolutioners that's maybe going to try to lose or maintain weight, but you have a little bit of trouble maybe quitting the sweet treats, that is exactly what Built Bar is for. It tastes like a candy bar, maybe even better than a candy bar, but it's covered in 100% chocolate. Most Built Bars have like 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein or somewhere in there. And compare that to a candy bar, like a run-of-the-mill candy bar has like 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, dozens of net carbs. So go to all of your stupid secret stashes that you're hiding from your spouse, we all do it, and replace all that with Built Bars. So that way, when it's 2 a.m. and you go to the cabinet for a sweet treat, this is a situation that every person has and relates to and absolutely is not unique to me. You can have a Built Bar, something that's a little better for you, instead of a sugary candy bar. Even if you're not a huge fan of like working out, you're not in the big like fitness thing, Built Bar is still a delicious treat. So you can head on over to Built.com and use promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, to get 15% off of your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. The college football playoff preview is live right now. It is a separate podcast feed from any Locked On podcast. It is called the Ultimate College Football Playoff Preview. It's like what we did for the draft or what NBA did for their draft or whatever. Local experts, betting advice, draft analysis. It's the most comprehensive college football preview you can find, and it's live now wherever you find your favorite shows. Let's keep going with defense, I think, because in this Rams game, good Lord, Sean McVay is fun. That's my takeaway. He did so many fun things that really put the Vikings in a bind, and they just don't really have the talent to contend with some of this stuff. And defensively, we'll get to it, but there's a lot of just talent deficiency things that also happen where the Rams just have like dudes and the Vikings don't have as many like dudes. We'll get to that, but in terms of offensively for the Rams, they did a really good job, and Zimmer adjusted for this eventually. I think it took him like 2 drives about to adjust for it, which I think is fair. But McVay came out in a way that, if you know what you're looking at, can teach you a lot about the way the Vikings play coverage and the way that teams should be attacking that. But of course, not everybody's Sean McVay, so they're not going to see this kind of thing every week. And they haven't seen this thing every week. But let me give you an example. This is a play that blew my mind, and I posted a big long thread about it on Twitter. But basically, the Rams come out in a 3-by-1 formation. So it's 3 wide receivers, 1 wide receiver on the other side, right? So 3 guys on one side, 1 on the other, and I think the back was on the weak side with only 1 guy. So when you're in 3-by-1, when there's 3 wide receivers on the same side of the formation, any man-match cover team, which is like most teams by this point, this is not unique to the Vikings at all, it's very common, will go into what I guess you call like a box coverage or a 4-over-3 coverage. But that means you're going to have 4 defenders responsible for covering those 3 people, and all 4 of those defenders will have whatever rules that determine who covers who is going to depend on the specific coverage call. But it'll come from the box family of coverages, or you do a full field coverage if you're doing something different. But it was a box coverage in this particular case, 4 versus 3, and that's supposed to be an advantage for your defense, right? 4 versus 3. And then one of those guys in the 3-by-1 was a tight end, Tyler Higbee, who was lined up in line. He motions across the formation at the snap. So the snap happens and he immediately motions over. There's no pre-snap time for people to process this. They have to do it live. That means 3-by-1 just turned into 2-by-2. Now, when there's 2-by-2, that's 2 guys on either side of the formation, 2 receivers on either side of the formation, and then a running back's like somewhere who is part of it, but not really. Then you go to a triangle coverage, right? If there's 2 receivers on your side of the formation, 3 defenders will be assigned to cover those 2 receivers, 3-over-2, right? Triangle coverage. You get it? Triangle box. Makes sense? And the thing is, the rules from a box coverage versus the rules from a triangle coverage are completely different. And a lot of the time, a box coverage will have like a sibling in the triangle coverage family, where in that box, 3 of the 4 people do the exact same thing they would have done in a triangle coverage. You add a 4th guy in there who like man-to-man somebody. And so and a lot of times that man-to-man guy is the outside corner. So say Patrick Peterson will go man-to-man on somebody. And then as soon as a tight end motions over, he's no longer man-to-man on somebody. He's now part of a triangle coverage. And, you know, the like Eric Hendricks goes and becomes part of the other side of the coverage or whatever. That's the trouble of it, though, is that your assignment just changes entirely. It just goes to something completely else, and you have to cover that in real time. You have to process all that in real time, and it leads to mistakes. And the way that McVay set these up, it really, really attacked Xavier Woods and the corners, and sometimes like Barr and the linebackers, and Barr looked pretty slow in this game. In some coverage. I mean, he obviously had a phenomenal game. Don't mistake me for not agreeing with that. But he did have some moments where you could tell the speed isn't the way it used to be, and they exploited that. But sometimes it was just making Xavier Woods process like 6 triggers all in one, and then it would cause him to hesitate like a half a beat, which is honestly like so understandable. I have absolutely no idea how any safety ever like processes anything in the NFL. And then, you know, he'll be a beat late and then it's a completion. Eventually, Zimmer adjusted to this and changed the way that he was doing coverages and stuff, and changed the way that he was approaching coverages where somebody like motions across the field or runs across the field, some simpler things. And that worked really, really, really well, and did some more blitzes, get some pressure on Matt Stafford, kind of ruin all that fancy stuff and punch it in the mouth. And that worked really well, and that caused Matt Stafford to make a bajillion mistakes, and their passing game kind of fell apart at the end of the game. But then the run defense went really bad for reasons we already discussed. But I was just fascinated with McVay. Now, don't get me wrong. This is absolutely a case of McVay being good and the Vikings being a team that runs this scheme. And a lot of teams run this scheme, so the Vikings running this scheme isn't really an indictment of them at all. It's a lot more McVay being good than the Vikings being bad in this particular case. And I actually came away, I was live at the stadium. I came away really impressed with the coverage. Watching the tape, I'm really impressed with the coverage still. Especially Cameron Dantzler, who outside of the one touchdown at the end of the game, I thought he had a pretty nice day. I thought Patrick Peterson had a pretty nice day. It was a nice outing, I thought, for the coverage unit. And Mackenzie Alexander got beat man-to-man a lot. That was pretty rough. But yeah, I don't know. I thought the coverage was fine. The run defense was really bad. And in this game, the Rams, like EPA-wise, their passing EPA was negative. Their rushing EPA was positive, which is wild. That's like backwards. That's not the way it should be. Of course, all the interceptions help and stuff. But the fact that their rushing EPA was positive is obviously the problem that needs to get fixed. And you got Aaron Jones coming to town, so you got to fix it. But I do also want to talk about the offense. So don't let me get too wrapped up in everything. We'll talk about that too. Okay, so offensively, a bunch of problems came from Aaron Donald. And you just have to throw those plays out because, I can't tell you how many times I just scoffed at the tape watching Aaron Donald just blow somebody out, doing something that not a single other person in the NFL can do. And it's like, well, you take that L, but nobody else is going to do that to him. I thought on the whole, I think I saw there was one really bad rep from Garrett Bradbury, and the rest of the game I was really impressed with. I didn't think Oli Udoh had the worst game. He got beat up a little bit, and I thought Ezra Cleveland had ups and downs. Didn't love what I saw from Brian O'Neill. Didn't love what I saw from Christian Darrisaw, but neither of them really bothered me that much. I thought the O-line had we're going to call it an okay game, like a mediocre, I'll call it a mediocre, I think is a decent word for it, kind of game. And there was still pressure and stuff that came on Kirk Cousins. But really, I want to talk about Kirk Cousins. And I've gone real hard at him this week. And so let me further explain myself, because I think I have a reasonable diagnosis of what I think is going on, and that means I have a suggestion for how to fix it too, instead of just whining. So I think Kirk Cousins has been going through a little bit of a footwork thing this year. I noticed a few weeks ago that his feet weren't pointing, his feet were opening up too much. And what I mean by that, if you've ever golfed, you might understand that language too, like opening an open stance. But your feet, if you draw a line from your back toe to your front toe, that line should point at what you're throwing at. You should be squared up with what you're throwing at, like that, like perpendicular. And Cousins was a little bit to the left. It was a little bit open. So his shoulders were open, and it was harder for him to get velocity. And then to get velocity, he has to throw a little bit more with his arm. And when you're throwing a bunch with your arm, then things go off target and you lose it, right? Now, this wasn't a big problem. It was just things were just a little bit off, and a lot of times Justin Jefferson could make the catch anyways. It wasn't a huge thing, but I noticed every time one would sail or one would be a little off target, it looked like his stance was a little open. I think he's resetting his feet and is aware of this now, and it's just taking him longer. Now, I don't know a ton about QB footwork. I could totally be wrong here, but what I know I'm not wrong about is that balls are arriving to receivers later than they should be. So whether that's Cousins taking too much time to throw it, waiting too long for receivers to clear things, to clear linebackers and stuff, that might be the case where, if there's a linebacker in the throwing lane, he wants to wait for the receiver to clear it, and he's letting the receiver clear it too much, and it's taking too much time, and then the ball arrives a little late, and then somebody else comes in and causes a problem. But balls have been arriving late, and they've always arrived late from, this is a problem that crops up with him every once in a while. This is definitely not the first time he's struggled with the ball arriving late, with holding the ball too long or whatever. There is not a lot of throwing with anticipation. And that's a rhythmic thing. That's a feeling the game thing. Cousins is thinking a lot right now. And it's just a thing, he gets into these cycles where he thinks a ton. And he's, doing a lot of thinking on the fly, and his brain just isn't wired to do that naturally. So there's a lot of forcing it, and it's very uncomfortable and tightly wound. And that's when you get the conserve occur chaos meter in the gray kind of games. With this one, I think he's taking a moment to reset his feet. And when he resets his feet, that little beat that takes, and then that little beat, I mean, we're talking a quarter second, maybe a half a second. We're not talking about a lot of time at all, but that little, a quarter second is a step or two. Half second is, 2 or 3 steps. That causes just enough of the spatial dynamic of downfield to change, where uncontested catches become contested and so on. Doesn't crop up every play. Sometimes things are greatly timed. Sometimes he gets the ball out great. And sometimes it's totally something, the pressure happens and he's got to scramble. It's like not his fault at all. But I've noticed this a couple times in these last couple games as I watch this, that the ball comes out late a little bit. Now, if he can get it to where he's gone through enough of his progression on the drop back. I mean, his eyes are downfield on the drop back, and a lot of times Cousins has gotten to read number 2 by the time he hits the top of his drop, and he knows where he's going to go with the ball by the top of his drop, and then it's just a matter of timing it out. He processes this really, really fast. So sometimes he gets there, and hopefully he can get to the point where he gets there at the top of his drop, and he can get the top of his drop can get his feet set instead of having to reset his feet. And hopefully that can fix a little bit of the timing issues that he's been having with Justin Jefferson, and the other receivers and stuff. I wanted to go really, really deep into that because because I find it interesting. And if I'm totally wrong about QB footwork, I'm definitely willing to be corrected on this. It's an educated guess based on what I understand about QB footwork, but it's definitely not my strong suit. But that is causing a problem here. But there's also, I think, just a general hesitation and a general desire to be safe, where, you're going to wait for that linebacker to clear way out of the throwing window, and he could probably push that a little more. And he's going to, decline some windows that look a little tight, and he could push that a little more. And with your back against the wall, you're going to be an underdog on the road out in the cold. Now or never, I think, to push it a little more. We'll see if Kirk Cousins even has that in him. But also, talking about Clint Kubiak in the offense, the offense is kind of sloppy, and the defense actually suffers from the same issue. The Vikings have a precision issue. There's a screen in this game where Kene Wangu took 2 extra steps out. The screen was supposed to set him up at a little bit outside the hash. He was halfway between the hash and the numbers, and he just missed his landmark. It was a screen, right? So he's drawing out. There was a linebacker that has him in man coverage, which you'll often see on a screen. You actually like that on a screen because it means nobody else is around. But because he ran too far outside, the linebacker chased him too far outside. It gave Garrett Bradbury way too much ground to cover. And he's a big old offensive lineman. He's fast for alignment, but he's for alignment, right? He's never going to carry all that. So Wangu had to work back toward him, didn't work back toward him, just ran right into the linebacker. And it turned out to be, I think, a loss of yardage, completion for negative yardage. There was that screen, and apparently I don't know, a lot of people thought that was Bradbury's fault. There's no way that's Bradbury's fault. There's no way that the play actually expects an offensive lineman to get directly to leave a defensive lineman unblocked. So you have as much time as it takes, an edge rusher to get to the quarterback unblocked. You have that much time to set up the screen, and you're asking a center to do a lookout block and then get all the way out to, halfway between the hash and the number. There's no way that that's actually the design. The running back just ran it out too far, and it screwed up the angles. That sort of precision thing is happening. On the defensive side, there's the DJ Wonnum has a bad habit of going too deep when he doesn't get contact, when he doesn't get through contact the way he wants to, which happens to him a lot. He's kind of a beanstalk. He'll kind of get a little bit of depth. He'll go downfield a little bit to try to get around the guy, buy him a little bit of extra space to use his speed to get around someone instead of trying to go through someone if he hasn't, successfully defeated the block. But then now that he's gone 2 or 3 yards downfield, that's 2 or 3 more yards that the running back gets. And he cedes that way too often. And Patrick Jones has done this too. And I think that's something that you can only kind of drill if you don't have a whole bunch of other stuff to fix. That's the precision, the detail issues that happen. Okay, now we all know what the play call is. Now we all know where to go. Now let's do this precisely and let's drill it a whole bunch. And you just don't have time to do that if you're dealing with a bunch of other things. I think this is another thing. I think I said it on Monday's show, or I said it on someone's show. The Vikings season kind of went kaput in August. They made mistakes in training camp that they're still kind of being punished for. And not being able to drill this enough is another punishment for some of the things that they had to do in training camp, install new plays. Of course, there's a bunch of drama in training camp that I'm sure took away from this. Having a bad training camp means you're going to have a bad season. And I think this team is like vastly underachieving for the amount of talent it has. I think everybody can agree with that. And those little detail things lead to that. So look, tomorrow's Crossover Thursday, we'll talk to Peter Bukowski. I'll try to troll him a little bit, see if I can't get him going off. It's always fun to talk to Peter about the Packers, but then we got to talk about this Packers game. Everything is still on the line. They have a chance to crawl right back into this if they can go pull off an upset. Easier said than done, but hey, if the team's got any heart, now's the time to show it. So we'll talk about all of that. In the meantime, check out the Locked On Bets podcast with your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.